All right, guys, can you hear me? All right, I'm going to do something I rarely do, which is time myself during a talk, because I really want to get to the other two speakers as well, and I don't want to cut into their time, so anybody who's ever heard one of my talks knows it can run a little bit long. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to express my appreciation to the Houston History Association for having this conference. I think it's essential for folks to know, people to know what their history is. I think it has all kinds of practical ramifications that we don't take into account. And so my goal for this talk today, this is kind of an odd topic. It says the prairie that built Houston, not Houston was built on the prairie. But what we'll find out is it's very much true that it went both ways. It was a two-way transaction. So let me go ahead and give you the assumptions for this talk. One is that I believe that teaching history without without paying attention to the natural environment in which it was created is like painting without a canvas. I heard somebody earlier this day say something like, well, you can pick a place because of its fresh water, but really well, how are you getting water and food if you don't have soil or rivers? Location, biogeography, where you're located does make a huge difference, and it has made a huge difference for us. Transportation is only as good as the natural resources it's built on. Houston was built on a prairie, like I said, but the prairie helped build the city and helped forge the character of the people who live here, including the culture of the people who live here. I believe that prairie restoration and all ecological restoration, where you're trying to bring back historical landscapes, is an act of living historical preservation. And it's also a memorial. It's deeper than that. It's a memorial to the Native Americans who lived here. It's a memorial to the pioneers who founded this area. And so it's a very sacred trust for bringing back these landscapes. It's not just about the bugs and the bees. The history and prairie communities are natural allies. Basically, in my opinion, what we're trying to do is trying to get Houstonians from doing something that they've traditionally done, which is run away from themselves and run away from their history and bury it and destroy it and tear it down. That is very much what's happened with this characteristic landscape, the prairie, in that we've even outlawed it in some places. You can't have a grass taller than 18 inches, even though it's been here for 7,000 years. And I believe that all school children, just let you know, I have a degree in biology and a master's degree in science education. I'm a certified teacher. I think it's an injustice that children go through our educational system without knowing where they live. And that includes history of where they live and how natural history guided that and oftentimes gave us what we needed to survive. So I'm going to use this term quite a bit, heartland, today. And a heartland, for you guys who might be thinking about more of the John Cougar Mellencamp heartland of the middle of the country, really just means a central area that has a lot of significance economically, politically, in sentiment. It's basically a place where we draw as a people a lot of our cultural cues. It helped us to get on the road economically, all that stuff. And for Houston, and the argument that I'm going to be making today, the heartland is the prairie. It is who we are. And if we destroy it, and if we don't treasure it, and if we don't teach about it, we're losing a piece of ourselves. So, heard some discussion this morning about what the prairie was. And a lot of people have a real confusion about the prairie and what it is. They say, Houston was founded in a swamp. That's not true. Houston was founded on a very wet prairie. In fact, someone said it was a mosquito-infested prairie. And in some ways it was. In fact, Romer, traveling through this area in 1845, said this about an area just west of downtown. He said, hardly had we left the city when the flat Houston prairie loomed up as an endless swamp. All the low coastal region presents a similar picture during this time of the year. Darkness fell and we still hadn't reached the end of the prairie, nor did we find a single place that was dry enough to lie down. There was not a stick of wood that could be used to kindle a fire. And it was vast, and vast in places that you might not guess. There was a man named Charles Sealsfield who came to Galveston Island in 1832. And this is what he found. It said, "It is called Galveston Island, but has neither hill nor valley, nor house nor farm, not even a tree with the exception of the 3 stunted trees on the western end. but from which the extreme flatness of the ground are visible from a great distance. So what people take from that is that this was a wet, mosquito-filled prairie that wasn't worth anything. I've heard the term undeveloped land, and as a biologist, I got to tell you, for a grassland that took 100,000 years to develop, I take great offense to that. But also because what we've lost is, if you've ever heard people say, oh, Houston's ugly. Well, let me read you another account from a visitor who came from Anahuac to Brazoria in a spring. He said, I had never been at all prepared for the indescribable beauty of the Texas prairie. For the indescribable beauty of the Texas prairie at this season of the year, the wildflowers spread around us in the utmost profusion and wonderful variety. Some of those which are cultivated in our northern gardens were here in full bloom and perfection, intermingled with many I had never seen before, of different color and forms. These fields of flowers were extensive beyond all limitation. After looking on their rich and ever-varying display, I, though as could, give up my Mustang his liberty, throw myself on the ground, and spend the whole season among them. This place was a place, at some times of the year, of unparalleled beauty. You don't think about that being Houston, but it was absolutely true. This is what the University of Houston would have looked like before it got built. Okay, you guys are very much sitting on an old, tens of thousands of year old prairie here. This is all called Blazing Star, and it'll play a little role in our talk today. This is also a ghost that you're looking at. This is a prairie that is no longer, called Psalms Road Prairie. So that'll figure into our talk as well. And I'm just going to go through these slides rather quickly because I got quite a few. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to give you some information. But when the settlers first got here, just to give you an indication of how wild this place was, and that's just not the city of Houston and all the bars, this place was a place of very large and charismatic animals. So we had buffalo herds that numbered in the tens of thousands of animals at times for the very earliest folks. Everybody had horned lizard where they probably live today. And we even had this, if it plays. Now this is a ghost sound. That's a wolf that used to live here, called the red wolf. It had lived here for thousands of years, and we found them in many paleontological digs. Along with that, we had pronghorn antelope, we had innumerable insects and all kinds of stuff. And if you look at these early plans of the city, you think, geez, who cut all those trees down? But the truth is, if you've ever gone down to Prairie Street in downtown Houston, that's where the line of merchants were located, and everything south of that was a prairie. That's why it's called Prairie Street, right? And if you looked at when they got here, they saw this immense prairie, but it was part of a gigantic system. Everything in green was a prairie at one time called the Coastal Prairie, and a portion in Louisiana was called the Cajun Prairie, but ecologically it's the same thing. If you looked at the Houston area, the Space City, yeah, we're the Space City, and we're the Bayou City and all that stuff. I think we're the Prairie City. I think we were, in some ways, very much in the heartland of that prairie at one point. There's where I work, the historic Katy Prairie. And that green bit is what I'm trying, along with a lot of other hardworking people, to expand and save before it's all concrete. So, why care about this prairie? A bunch of weeds, right? Well, turns out not so simple. First of all, a very undertold story, even in I didn't hear this in 7th grade history, is the Battle of San Jacinto and how the prairie helped us win there. The way I learned in 7th grade, basically General Houston was brilliant. The Mexicans didn't know they were there and they snuck up on them somehow. I don't know if they teleported into their camp or what they did. But the truth is there was a prairie separating the two encampments. Of course, the Mexican soldiers knew that the Texians were there. The difference is the biogeography. If there was a forest between the two camps, they would have crunched their way towards the Mexican army. Wouldn't have worked. If there was a river between there, it wouldn't have worked. The fact is, it had been a really wet winter. The prairie grass had grown up really tall. I was just collecting seeds down at the San Jacinto Battleground on Thursday. It's like this tall already. It's very tall. And that prairie helped to shield them before they could take the ridge that would eventually give them the high ground to come down on the Mexican army. Now, if you look at the paintings of the battle, it looks like they're having that on a soccer field, that battle on a soccer field. Not exactly the case. but we're very much used to taking a lot of credit as human beings for historical happenings, right? We're not used to giving nature its due sometimes. But by far, one of the most important reasons to know something about the history of the prairie is because it was the original black gold. When we got here, NASA wasn't around, petrochemical wasn't around. People looked around and said, how can I survive in this place and how can I make a living in this place? Well, there are some things that they knew and there are some things that they brought from other places. And they went around, they looked around, they said, well, we can do shipping, but you know, we got to ship something. We can't ship air. So what are we going to ship? Well, we can ship a lot of different things. Well, one thing that you can ship a bunch of is food. So a lot of what the early merchants looked at and the advertisements for these merchants went along something like this. It didn't say, come to our, fantastic medical center or anything. I'm going to read this line because it doesn't show up real well. It says, rich, fine prairie loam land, splendid markets and shipping facilities. And then basically it goes on this huge litany of things you can grow here. Geography is important. Biodiversity is important. Yes, ma'am?
The timeline of that.
The timeline of this one, I couldn't find a definitive date on this, but this is the late 1800s. Okay, I couldn't find it. It was in a replication. And the reason that prairie soil was so fertile was this. Can I have 3 people come up? Yep, you can move. That's all right. Listen, I'm a naturalist. I'm used to working with kids, so I never sit down for too long. I want you to take that, and I want you to pass it on to your next person, and your next person, and your next person, and then I want you to hold it up. This is a life-size picture of one of the tall grasses from our tall grass prairie. This is life-size. So what I'm trying to tell you here, guys, is they got here, and what they found was soil that had taken thousands upon thousands of years to develop. I'm doing a fossil dig right now for Ice Age mammals. And what we're finding is a grassland has existed in Houston for at least 100,000 years. When you dig in your garden, you go, I'm hitting gumbo automatically. That's probably how your house was put there. The rich topsoil that was in place here made it so that you could grow just about anything. Okay? You can lay it down. I'll roll it up at the end. That's called switchgrass, by the way. So what did people do? They moved here and they started growing the heck out of stuff. The first people started growing cattle on Bolivar in 1819. And in fact, there are all kinds of advertisements. And what happened was they started marketing this place as the coast country and kind of getting people to move here because of the richness of the soil. Later on, many of the, basically a lot of the transportation in this town was built because of the prairie. It was basically used to move the richness of the prairie soil to make dollar bills. That's what it was made for. The first railroad in this area was done in the 1850s. The primary reason was to move product from farming and ranching and agriculture to town. Once we grew a particular prairie product so well, we wanted to move it off to market, right? So we built the ship channel, another usage of the prairie to build infrastructure for the city. In fact, take a look at those 2 city seals. City of Houston, a train and a plow. City of Tomball, a tractor, a cow, and a train. I see this on a lot of city seals around here. And so, one of our first major sources of income was cattle production. These are cowboys from the 1870s. These are African-American cowboys working the prairie down on Galveston Island, the saltgrass prairie, the most productive prairie. And up and through the late 1940s, we think about Fort Worth stockyards and all that baloney. Harris County had more head of cattle than any county in the state of Texas. It's no reason that we have the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, our premier cattle event. What I tell kids is, do you have forest cowboys? Do you have ocean cowboys? Do you have rainforest? No. Cowboys are built on the prairie. And a lot of that culture we got transmitted down to us through things like the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. People came here from all over the world to grow stuff. They came from even as far away as Japan to grow rice. When we didn't know how to grow rice, we brought people in from Japan to help us grow rice down in League City. Makawa Road, that whole stretch down there near League City now, many of that land is owned by the descendants of these Japanese rice farmers. We didn't know how to grow other things, other crops. So we moved people in who could grow the crops or had an interest in growing crops and had grown things in their home countries like Germany and Czechoslovakia and other places, the Midwest. And here's an important point that goes, you can talk about economics all day, but the truth of the matter is a lot of our valuing system, the things we'd like to still do today, came from that prairie experience. This is a good picture, and I couldn't find a date on this one either. But as I identify the species in that photo, you got a black-tailed jackrabbit, you got, looks like a sandhill crane, you got some puddle ducks that live on the wet prairies. That was a prairie hunting expedition. Hunting's very much a part of our heritage and our culture here. The rodeos, that's a League City rodeo from the early 1900s right there. There's so many rodeos around this area is because it was built on that history. And it's really not that far back they have to go and to see, because a lot of people don't believe me that this place was a prairie, that we really were a prairie. I think this picture was shown earlier, that's Rice University. Anybody guess that one up on the upper right-hand corner there? That's Tomball in 1896. This metropolis down here, that's Katy, 1912. And that sprawling new community was Tanglewood in the 1950s, which used to be a cattle and hay raising area, basically. But there's a problem, and that is that our heartland is vanishing. That's what that prairie looked like when we started rescue efforts there in 2008. 4 months later, that's what it looked like. Heartbreaking. It's like somebody took a shovel to the middle of a coral reef. And in fact, if you look across the area, the prairie was so utterly productive and has been so utterly productive and easy to build on that that's what's left today. What you're looking at is one of the most endangered ecosystems on planet Earth. And yet very few of our school children even know that. They're learning about the rainforest, the polar ice caps, all that stuff, and that's great. Love it. But they don't know where they're from. And they don't know what's sitting outside their back door. And the possibility to affect and change and to live history. So what we're doing is we're working to do a couple of things. One is to do something very difficult, which is to get Houstonians to stop running from their history. To basically say that this is a justified landscape. So many codes outlaw this landscape. So what we do is we are putting pocket prairies in places where people don't expect them. So I went to the Herman Park Conservancy not that long ago, a couple of years ago, and said, hey, let's bring the prairie back to Herman Park. And they said, what are you talking about? Our mission is to reforest the park. I said, what are you talking about? Well, it used to be a big forest. I said, no, it wasn't. And they said, what are you talking about? And I showed them this. Looking across the flat prairie, Mrs. Palmer Hutchison chose a lot on North Boulevard that had a single weesatch tree growing on it. This weesatch tree had always been used to tie up horses by the young men riding out of town to shoot prairie chickens. That's a picture of Rice in 1910. I can identify those flowers as snow on the prairie. So I'm not going to have time to show you this, but I'm going to have time to show you the after effects. So we started this project a couple of years ago, and that's what it looked like. This is between the Japanese Garden and McGovern Lake. Today, this very little patch of habitat is the most biodiverse place in the whole park. While other parts of the park maybe have, in an area this big, maybe 20 species, this has about 85 species in it. And there are birds that go to this patch that don't go to any other part of the park. Now this is going to horrify you. This is a horror show. Ooh, let me see if I can get this to go. Now, for you guys who are into historic preservation, this is probably not a pretty picture. That's the Prudential building, right? But what I want to tell you is, even though that building was lost, we're working with MD Anderson to plant a temporary prairie there. So people from all across the world can learn about our natural resources. At the end of the building cycle, when they're ready to put another building there, we're going to transport all those plants to local schools so kids can have living history on their campus. We're also putting in, next year, about 11 plus acres of prairie along Buffalo Bayou between Sabine and Shepherd. So the prairie is making a comeback in places both big and small. Now I want you to listen to these words real quick.
stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
School kids need to know that that didn't come out of the thin air. That described life here in Houston for so many people for so many years. Deep in the heart of Houston. This was an agricultural community, and it's almost like a mother that brought you up and then you stick her in the basement so that nobody knows that's your mom. You know, for me. Now, that sounds a little dramatic, but it's like people don't want you to know where they're from, and it's a really cool story. I'm working with these kids down at Kashmere Gardens, real poor school, and their historical connection to the prairie are those black cowboys. None of these kids knew they were black cowboys. So there are all kinds of ways that we can engage our students to make it so that they know where they live in the world. How can we ask them to be citizens of a place if they don't know where that place is? That's a question I have for education. So we're doing all kinds of stuff. I made this website, Prairie 101, to educate and to provide educational materials for teachers. We built a prairie in the middle of the Museum of Fine Arts last year. And then we disassembled this exhibit and sent it to a bunch of different schools. About 15,000 people have seen it at this point. And fortunately, it's retired because it's really heavy. Last thing is all wooden. I made it out of aluminum the second time. All right. I don't want to go over on time. So basically, here's the upshot. The upshot is this. A couple of years ago, I helped found an institution called the Coastal Prairie Partnership, because nobody had told the story of the landscape, the ecosystem that built Houston, that Houston was built on. And I did a word search, a website search for Coastal Prairie. And what I found out was there was no website. It's like this thing that was bigger than 8 US states never existed. And I thought, geez, we used up this thing and we gave it no credit whatsoever. That ain't right. That's a moral question. And so many of you folks are in the moral business, right? You don't think it's morally right or from your valuing system to rip down history? It's not just a question of aesthetics or logical thinking. It's an emotional valuing system. And I think very much about this about the prairie. And I'm not going to be satisfied until every school child in this city can tell me what a darn coastal prairie is and what it did for this city. And I'll know I'm successful when I have the folks from Discovery Green say, we got to have a piece of that coastal prairie in Discovery Green. Because at that point, I will recognize something important, that Houston has readopted its heartland. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Guys, as I wrap up, one thing I will do is I'm going to hand you a copy of this. This is the Atlas of Biodiversity for the whole Houston area. Can't know history without biology. So I'm going to hand you one of these copies for free. And I'm going to pick up the 3D goggles